In their will, everything went to the sibling who never came to visit, even though I took care of my parents during their illness. It was the kind of day I ought to have fondly recalled. Through the draperies, the sun was softly penetrating. I had recently returned from getting my mom's prescription filled out and went to her favorite bakery to get the banana nut muffins she used to enjoy before the chemotherapy turned everything into cardboard. She didn't express gratitude. She didn't. Since my brother Andrew was allegedly flying in for a brief stay, she simply glanced at the bag, tossed it aside, and asked if I had remembered to hoover the guest room. Although I had hardly had time to sit down since 6 in the morning, I nodded and said yes. I was still wearing the same leggings with faint chicken broth stains from the previous evening and the same sweater I had worn to bed. Not even my mother noticed. Perhaps she simply didn't care. However, I heard her talking to one of her friends on the phone as I poured her tea. Lukewarm, just the way she preferred. I then heard the words that would permanently alter something inside of me. Unlike Andrew, she is a sweet girl. He's the one I'm truly proud of. She never amounted to much, but she means well. My heart sank behind my ribs as I stood there, the tea quivering in the cup. The words alone weren't enough. The effortlessness with which she uttered them was noteworthy. She expressed them as though they were the absolute truth, as if I hadn't sacrificed everything for her and Dad. I didn't go up to her. With a smile that I had learnt to deploy over the years, I put the tea down gently and said, "I'll be in the kitchen if you need me." But I broke down in some way. I heard Andrew's voice reverberating down the hallway that evening as I was preparing dinner. He was laughing loudly as if he owned the place while FaceTiming someone. It had been more than 2 years since his last visit. He didn't visit for Dad's surgery. Not for the falls, Mom. But now that their health was actually failing, he appeared for a few days and received a lot of acclaim. He was obviously talking to me when he said, "Yeah, I don't know how she does it. She doesn't even have a legitimate job. She simply stays at home, providing them with live and nursing care." Well, someone has to do it, right? A nurse who lives in. I had become a live-in nurse. I had become more than just a daughter. No human. They saw me only as a proxy for the person they truly cared about. It had been years since I had celebrated my birthday. It was not a holiday. To be here for them, I had sacrificed everything: my flat, my publishing career, my social life. I was the one who never amounted to much, though. I believed that day was the worst it could have been. Then, however, the will occurred. Tuesday was chilly. The attorney for my parents requested that we meet at their home. For months, I had been anticipating it. Despite her poor state, my mother insisted that we read the will so that things wouldn't become messy later. My father had died 3 weeks prior following a protracted struggle with Alzheimer's. I prepared tea. I wiped down the table. To maintain a serene atmosphere, I lit a candle. I recall Andrew showing up there late, wearing sunglasses and carrying a woman I had never seen before. The attorney then opened the folder. After reading the standard legalese, he stopped, cleared his throat, and declared Andrew Thomas Mills would be the only beneficiary of the whole estate, including the property, investments, and retirement money. No one ever mentioned my name, not once. I remained motionless. I refrained from crying. I didn't even raise my eyes. Reliving every meal I had prepared, every night I had stayed up by their bedside, every doctor's appointment, every insulin shot, every diaper change, and every call I had made to insurance companies when they were too exhausted to comprehend the bills, I simply stared at the grain of the wooden table in front of me. I couldn't be seen. "What was said by my mother?" she whispered. "You possess a kind heart," while casting me a chilly gaze. However, Andrew is in greater need of this. I stopped breathing at that point. Not due to the inheritance, but due to the treachery. Because I had given up everything, and all they saw was the son who came twice a year with ostentatious presents and meaningless platitudes. Wrapped in my dad's old blanket, I sat by myself in the backyard that night and gazed up at the stars. And that's when I realized I needed to take action. I didn't get any sleep that evening. I've spent years learning how to work through fatigue, so it's not that I couldn't, but rather that I didn't want to. The house was silent after reading the will, yet it felt different, heavier, and final. As though the news had been as unimportant as the weather, my mother had gone to bed silently. Shortly after, Andrew walked away, without looking at me, and muttered something about his flight being rescheduled. And until morning crept up the sky as if nothing had happened, I sat there, in the same place. However, everything had. Out of habit, I made oats, bread, and scrambled eggs for breakfast that morning. On the table, I placed a plate for my mum. She never gave me a thank you. Never did. That day, everything remained the same. However, I didn't wait for her to inquire about washing or errands. I returned to my room, shut the door, and had some time to reflect. Not sense. Simply think. I began compiling a list. It wasn't just a list of tasks to complete. It was more than just a list of tasks to complete. All that I'd done for them, annually. Every sacrifice. Year 1, when Dad's memory began to fail, we moved back home. Year 2, when it became apparent that Mom couldn't manage him by herself, I quit my work. Year 3, acquired the ability to schedule doctor's appointments and handle his prescriptions. Year 4, due to Mom's collapse, I was unable to attend my best friend's wedding. Year 5, Dad had a seizure, so we spent Christmas in the hospital cafeteria. Year 6, became more fluent in insurance jargon than the majority of agents. Year 7, stopped going out. At 30, who would want to date someone who sleeps with a baby monitor next to her? 7 years. I lost 7 years of my life. Then I remembered Andrew. In those 7 years, what had he accomplished? Traveled. I stayed in condos that offered views of the city skyline, shared motivational quotes alongside filtered selfies. Possibly, the event occurs approximately every 2 months. Once came for Thanksgiving. Never spent the night. Nevertheless, he received everything. I was 12 years old when I fell off my bike and scraped my knees on the pavement, getting blood on them. My mother hurried past me to assist Andrew with his science fair project, which is why I sobbed. Not because it hurt, it was due the following day, but he had forgotten. I was strong, she remarked, and that I was capable of managing it, and I took her word for it that I had strength. Being calm, trustworthy, and helpful was important. I had no desire to surpass anyone. All I wanted was to be accepted for who I am. She once told me, "Andrew needs more help than you do," I recall. "You always manage things so well." I wasn't breaking, though, only because I was managing. It just meant that I didn't display it. I waited for them to notice me repeatedly. However, they never did. I became aware of this when I was out late on one of my grocery runs. I heard a woman talking on the phone as I was making my way down aisle 6, which was for cereal and snacks. "I sacrificed everything for them," she replied, her voice breaking. "I feel like I don't even exist anymore." I just stood there, motionless, with tears in the back of my eyes. I was holding a box of granola. I wasn't alone. All around the world, there are women daughters who bear the burden of a family, who quietly operate the machine in the background, and who receive no applause when the lights go out. At that point, I started to sense a change. I began to doubt everything. What made me believe that I owed them my life? Why did I think being invisible was my role? When did I come to the conclusion that duty took precedence over fulfillment? Most importantly, why was I still here? I called Samantha, an old acquaintance I hadn't spoken to in years. One evening. In college, we shared a room together. She got married, relocated to Seattle, became a therapist, and adopted a cat named Hugo. When I told her, she seemed taken aback, but she spoke in a gentle, compassionate tone. "If you need to talk, I'm still here," she said. So I did. For 2 hours, I spoke. I talked about the will my parents had left behind. In reference to the years I had lost, she paid attention, actually paid attention. Then she mentioned something that I found particularly memorable. We occasionally stay out of loyalty. However, sometimes this loyalty leads to losing one's sense of self. Just because they stopped seeing you doesn't mean you stopped existing. I did not shed a tear that night. I refrained from screaming. I sat silently, allowing the statement to reverberate in my head. I had tried for years to convince those who had already made up their minds of my value. In order to be a part of someone else's story, I had sacrificed my own. I wasn't even a footnote anymore. I was aware that I couldn't go back in time. However, I might be able to start composing something new. I was still unsure of how it would seem. However, I was aware of this. I couldn't continue to live like a ghost in a house that never accepted me. At first, I began to say no in little ways. It was subtle and nearly undetectable. It wasn't a loud statement or an emotional outburst, but it seemed seismic to me. The first time was on a Sunday morning when my mother requested me to take her to a baby shower for a distant cousin. After cleaning up all night after one of her sudden episodes of vertigo, I was exhausted. Ordinarily, I would have grinned, changed, picked up the keys, and left without protest. This time, though, I just told her I don't feel like going today while looking her in the eye. She blinked, stopped. Then her eyes narrowed. Do you mean that you're not feeling like it? I didn't wince. That's all. I will remain at home. She let out a sigh, murmured something about everything she had given up for me, and hurried off to make another phone call. Andrew, most likely. I didn't feel bad, though. Not now. Something within me was opened by that no, like a glimmer of light beneath a shut door. So I continued. I told her she could order takeaway when she asked me to make supper for her book club the next week. I told her that I had other arrangements when she asked me to reschedule one of my doctor's visits since her hairdresser had canceled. As I waited for me to lose it, I watched her simmer. However, I didn't. Then came the day I discovered it. I wasn't spying. After years of neglect, I attempted to finally organize the hallway closet. When I grabbed for an old stack of envelopes that were pushed behind a plastic container, they spilled all over the place. Bills, discounts, and expiring warranties were the most common items. However, one was very noticeable. It was an envelope from a downtown lawyer's office. Dense. The color is cream dot official. The revised will. I wish I could claim that I was taken aback. However, I already knew something. I read it while seated on the chilly tile floor. Slowly, with caution, as if they were reading the fine print of a terrible joke. Andrew was going to get everything. The home. The home offers significant cost savings. The life insurance. My father used to wind the dumb old clock every Sunday afternoon. They didn't even mention my name, not once. But there was a cue. Only one. Within 30 days of my death, my daughter may pick up any personal items she has kept on the property upon request. Ask, ask. As though my life here, my place in this family, needed to be negotiated gently. My digits became numb. The will must have crumpled in my lap for an hour while I sat on the floor before my breath returned. Until the trembling ceased. I didn't cry when I eventually got to my feet. I refrained from screaming. After making myself a drink of water and going to the kitchen, I stood at the window and saw the wind blowing through the garden I had planted. Tulips, daisies, lavender. I had personally dug the soil, placed the stones, and selected each plant according to which would blossom earliest and which would endure the seasons. It had never even been viewed by Andrew. He was going to inherit it too. That's when I realized I was unable to stay. Not in this house alone. This life of mine, where I was always a shadow of myself, was not what I wanted. Not in this position, where people's opinions of me were based on what I could accomplish for them without ever asking what I wanted in return. That evening, I started compiling a list. It wasn't about what I had given up, though, this time. It had to do with what I intended to reclaim. What remained of my employment was distant, adaptable. Tucked away was a tiny savings account of mine. My friend in Asheville had been urging me to stay with her for years. Take a breath. Leave. I took a few days to pack my belongings. I kept it a secret. I didn't write anything about it. I didn't write anything down. I did, however, phone a lawyer to avoid battling for the will. I no longer desired their money. What I sought was much more valuable. Finalization. The enchantment that held me bound to a family that only saw me when they were in need needed to be broken. I updated my phone number. The system redirected my mail, purchased the ticket. I prepared one last breakfast the morning before I left. Scrambled eggs. Toast. Mom liked her coffee, which was extremely strong with one sugar. As usual, I put it on the table. However, I didn't sit down this time. Her robe trailed behind her like a princess as she entered the kitchen. She whispered, "You're up early." I gave a small smile. "I'm going." She blinked. "To the shop?" "No, permanently." She gazed at me, uncertain of my sincerity. I grabbed my bag. I located the will. She opened her mouth, then shut it again. No one apologized. Don't deny it. Nothing but quiet, I whispered. I hope Andrew likes tulips. They will shortly bloom. And before she could answer, I left through the front door. I didn't turn around. During the bus ride, I didn't cry. I believed I would. As soon as the wheels left the curb and the well-known town faded into the distance, I feared I would lose it. However, I didn't. As though it had never truly belonged to me in the first place, I simply watched it all vanish through a dirty window. Rain and the aroma of pine welcomed me to Asheville. At the station, my buddy Lydia greeted me with an unexpectedly extended embrace. Even though we hadn't seen one another in years, there was something about the way she held me, as if she understood, that gave me the best kind of chest ache. Her guest room was cozy despite its little size. She had placed small pots of succulents on the windowsills and painted the walls a gentle shade of green. A bookshelf stood in the corner, already piled high with my favorite authors. She even left a welcome message in her sloppy, crooked handwriting on the pillow. Breathe. Get some rest. Get better. For what seemed like the first time in years, I let out a breath. I gradually started putting together a life that was exclusively mine over the course of the following few weeks. In the mornings, I walked for a long time, allowing my feet to discover new paths through the peaceful streets. Without someone shouting preferences from the adjacent room, I was able to rediscover the pleasure of cooking for myself. The sensation of clay molding between my fingers was soothing when I enrolled in a pottery class. There was something satisfying about creating something new out of nothing. I also stayed away. I didn't look at my previous phone. I didn't log into the shared family group chat. I didn't question if they were aware of my absence, until I received an email one evening from an attorney. It wasn't long, straightforward, a notice that the will had been formally revised by my mother. Once more, I was completely gone, not even a passing reference to property or personal possessions. The whole thing was now Andrew's. The news wasn't what hurt. The timing was the problem, because the week I left, she filed the change. That update from years ago wasn't forgotten. It was a final, conscious denial. 2 days after I said her farewell, her icy, unrepentant signature was dated. It was like a door being slammed. I spent a lot of time looking at the screen. I had no idea how I was meant to feel. Solace? Sadness? Fury? Rather, I felt emptiness, similar to a room that had at last been decluttered. Keep quiet. Chilly. However, it has potential. I shut down the laptop. Lydia entered at that moment, carrying a dish of cookies, and seemed to have seen a ghost. She handed me her phone and said, you might want to check this out. It was a video. The video was an excerpt from a discussion program that took place during the day. The logo was familiar to me, a piece about carers in the area. On the television, there I was, grinning. I'm laughing, discussing resiliency, about affection, about how my perspective on the world has been influenced by providing care. It was a tape recording of a community panel I had participated in a few weeks prior. I hadn't given it much thought. Lydia had invited me to a small gathering where I talked about my experience caring for my parents. It had apparently gone viral. The feedback was flooding in. You have such strength. My mother also had Alzheimer's. This brought tears to my eyes. She is the kind of daughter I wish I had. I blinked. I was being seen, not as a hardship, not as a letdown, not as a person who should be removed from a will. However, as a human, an entire one. Lydia gave me one of the cookies while sitting next to me and grinning. She said, "Your story matters." I allowed myself to believe it for a second. A journalist who had seen the program called me later that week. They desired to create a more in-depth article. An article, a podcast interview, perhaps. The silence that had constantly engulfed me suddenly started to break. My voice was sought after. People sought to comprehend. I didn't say yes right away. I felt afraid. My fear stems from the long-standing neglect I've endured. I'm afraid of what my family would say if they happened to find it. More than that, though, I was intrigued. What if sharing my story was what ultimately freed me? What if I could get back what they worked so hard to keep me from remembering after all these years? My value, my voice, my name. I started writing after opening the notepad I had been carrying around since the day I left. Not in retaliation, not even with rage, but from the truth. Because I would write my own story if they didn't include me in theirs, and I wouldn't be invisible this time. I kept the interview a secret from my family. I didn't hide it since I owed them nothing anymore, or at least not in the manner they would later accuse me of. On a Tuesday night, the story was broadcast. In a calm, well-lit Asheville studio, I had been interviewed by experts who treated my narrative with respect. I had talked about seeing two people who raised me gradually lose their independence while I gave up mine, about the long hours spent caring for my father's breathing treatments, and about learning how to securely get my mother out of bed following her stroke. I then explained what transpired to them, how Daniel, my younger brother, hadn't attended our father's funeral or any holidays in years, how I came upon the amended will that belonged to him in every way. Since quiet was the only language they had ever taught me, I packed my luggage and departed silently. I spoke something unexpected at the end of the interview. Love doesn't always look like flowers and birthday cards, I replied, looking directly into the camera. It can often take the form of changing adult nappies at 2 in the morning, or missing your doctor's appointment because your mother neglected to take her medication. And just because that kind of love isn't acknowledged, doesn't mean it wasn't genuine. A photo of me sitting in the garden I helped create in our backyard and gentle piano music marked the end of the segment. It was described as a silent depiction of invisible devotion by the interviewer. I had an overflowing email the following morning. Messages from complete strangers, including full-time carers, adult children, nurses, and even young pupils who had recently lost a grandmother. They said my experience reminded them of theirs. They expressed gratitude to me. They sobbed. Then, predictably, my phone rang. It was Miriam, my aunt. Unless something dramatic had happened, she never called. Her voice trembled as she said, "Sweetheart, has your mother contacted you?" I hadn't. She went on, "She's in pieces, feeling ashamed, claims that you damaged the family's reputation." It nearly made me chuckle. Out of sheer incredulity, not malice. "She wrote me against her will," I muttered. "I took care of her until she couldn't even remember my name. And the son who hadn't been inside the house for 6 years received everything from her." The person on the other end paused. "I know," Miriam said in a whisper. "It was insight, not suffering, that caused something inside of me to crack. They were all aware. Everyone was aware of Daniel's absence. Everyone was aware that I was responsible for managing her moods, loneliness, and deterioration, as well as picking up her prescription drugs and insurance. Nevertheless, nobody had spoken. When he emerged as the favorite, nobody questioned it. I was repeatedly shoved aside, and nobody protested. They had allowed it to occur. Miriam attempted to diffuse the situation. She holds traditional views on gender roles. According to her, men ought to inherit. That sons will continue the family name and daughters will marry off. I answered coolly that she had already given me her name. She also attempted to retract that. I ended the call. Daniel texted me that night. In a nutshell, good interview, don't apologize, no justification, just self-satisfied recognition. He was the kind of person who could say, "I see you now. However, it's too late." I didn't answer. Rather, I sent the interview video to the lawyer I had spoken with right before I left town. I posed the following query: "Is this sufficient to challenge the will?" His response was prompt: "Indeed." There was a weakness. It appears that North Carolina had a provision pertaining to care-based claims and probate disputes, particularly in cases where it could be demonstrated that one heir had been alienated from the other and had given long-term, unpaid care. I was unaware of that, but I did now, and now I had evidence. Emails, appointment logs, medicine receipts, and a handwritten note from my mother that once read, "You're the only one I can count on. Were all gathered over the course of the following 2 weeks." The house wasn't what I wanted. The money wasn't what I wanted. However, I wanted the truth to be documented. I kept it a secret when the documents were submitted. I allowed the quiet to deepen. Allow them to wriggle in doubt. Let them speculate about what might happen. And then my mother called me right before the court date. She sounded worn out. I had forgotten how gentle her voice was. She said, "I would rather not fight. Let's put this all behind us. You are my daughter. I cherish you." The words had the consistency of sugar on top of rust, too sweet. It's too late. When Dad was dying, I wanted to hear that, I said. When I was by myself in that house over Christmas and Daniel was sending you Amazon gift cards, I wanted to hear it. Before you secretly revised your will and removed my name from it, I wanted to hear it. She fell silent. I refrained from screaming. I refrained from crying. I'm not doing this to harm you, I just stated it. To honor what you disregarded, I'm doing this action. I hope one day you understand that, I continued. Then, perhaps for the last time, I hung up. I became aware that I was no longer upset as I stood by the window and watched the lines created by the late summer rain as it ran down the glass. I'm not the same person I was. Power was what I felt now, the silent variety, the kind that resulted from ceasing to request attention. Now, whether they liked it or not, they would see me. There was little fanfare on the day of the court hearing. I kept my trip a secret from everyone. I didn't dress for revenge. I did not opt for a spectacular entrance, angry eyeliner, or an angular red dress. I chose comfy shoes, black trousers, and a simple navy blouse, since I had no intention of proving anything there, something I was going to get back. Outside the courthouse, I was nodded to by my lawyer, Lisa, a woman with solid hands and sharper words. "Are you prepared?" she inquired. I gave a nod. I've always been prepared. It was silent inside, sterile. This is the type of setting where formality tends to obscure the truth. However, something felt different when the judge arrived and the proceedings started. Perhaps it was my silence's weight cracking. Perhaps it was seeing my name spoken at last, without doubt or embarrassment. Naturally, Daniel was present. Wearing a pricey blazer over a rumpled t-shirt, he arrived late, as if he was undecided about whether to impress the judge or act indifferent. His eyes briefly expanded at the sight of me. Then he smirked, as usual. I had been the backup kid for years, and that smile had followed me. It was the grin he wore when mocking my work at family dinners. The smile on his face when he arrived at our father's funeral intoxicated was still commended for showing up. But that smirk quickly vanished today. Lisa started by going over the care logs. She recorded more than 600 doctor's appointments. I have been providing primary care for 11 years. I have maintained medical records bearing my name. I have recorded videos of myself helping my mother with her daily tasks. I assist her with tasks such as writing letters and preparing cards for birthdays, pictures, neighborly testimonies, nurses. The interview followed. The 3-minute piece was silently watched in the courtroom. The room echoed with my voice. No one else would. So I did it. Since she was my mother, I did it. Love doesn't need to be rewarded, in my opinion. I simply didn't believe it would be penalized. Daniel's attorney seems clearly frightened. He got up and urged the judge to take the will's emotional intent into account. Lisa remained composed. We're not arguing about a signature. Motive is what we are fighting. This type of behavior is a final insult cloaked in legitimacy, not merely a will. And that is what we are here to reveal. The judge paid attention. That day, the decision was not made. However, something changed. Daniel knew, too. He cornered me at the lifts outside the courtroom. "Do you honestly believe that this will make a difference?" He gave a hiss. I was her choice. I gave him a direct look. No. She went with the simple option. I'm making the proper decision. I immediately turned to go. The family conversation that I had left months earlier came alive that evening. I heard about it without actually being in it. Screenshots were sent to me by my cousin. I received messages from relatives I hadn't seen in a long time. I was unaware that she endured all of that. Why didn't she get assistance? I regret that we didn't speak up sooner if this is the case. Then came the most powerful one. Why did we allow Daniel to escape punishment? I didn't respond. Not quite yet. I decided to make tea and log off instead. The quiet in my house didn't feel like a punishment for the first time in a long time. It was peaceful. Daniel's and my mother's attempts to regain control throughout the course of the following few weeks. They sent flowers. Sorry. I apologize for the half-heartedness of my invitations. Let's get together and chat. The problem with being ignored all your life, though, is that you don't miss them once you learn to exist without their voices. After 2 weeks, Lisa gave me a call. She stated that the judge's decision was partially in our favor. The court has recognized your contribution. but you won't receive the full estate. A fair share will be given to you. Relief was what I anticipated. However, I sensed something more profound: approval. It had nothing to do with money. It has to do with recognition, about getting noticed. I didn't even open the mail as soon as the formal documents came. It symbolized all the years I believed I had to prove my value to those who had already determined. I had none, so I sat with it in my lap and traced the edges with my fingertips. I then opened it. Go over the decision, I grinned. Slowly, I got up, went outdoors, and felt the crisp fall air caress my face. My neighbor knocked on the house that night carrying a pie. She said, I just saw your story last night. She was referring to the follow-up section. There are many people who are cheering you on. I grinned. Regards. I believe I'm finally supporting myself as well. We ate pie in solitude while sitting on the porch. Don't make a giant speech. Not much fanfare, just tranquility. And I understood that the loudest kind of retaliation was peace. I had no idea that mending would be so silent. Things simply slowed down after the court decision, the pie on the porch, the news story, and all the commotion, in a way that allowed for something I had never had before, rather than in a depressing, lonely way. Inhale. No more requesting favors via text message. No more guilt trips about being overly sentimental or passive-aggressive. No more keeping the peace by acting like I was fine, since I was no longer maintaining their tranquility. Mine was mine to keep. A month later, I left the house. It wasn't dramatic or hurried. Near a public area where people walked their dogs and elderly couples sat with folded newspapers on their laps, I discovered a small one-bedroom flat not far from the city. I filled the windowsill with lavender. Frankie, an elderly cat from the shelter, was adopted by me. And each morning when I awoke, I recognized that I was no longer angry. I didn't forget, though. I can still recall the phone calls that only came when they needed something, the anniversaries that no one celebrated, and the holidays when my plate seemed empty compared to everyone else's. However, my memory of them has changed. Not like throbbing scars. I no longer follow the lines on a map. Daniel and I met up at the grocery store one afternoon. He paced close to the checkout queue as if the world owed him an explanation, his phone glued to his palm and bags under his eyes. He froze when he saw me. I simply nodded to him and moved on. Avoid conflict. Avoid making sarcastic remarks. No, I did tell you so. Because she no longer lived here. The part of me that needed their approval, validation, and the final affirmation that I was correct was gone. It was because I didn't need it to be a win that that moment felt like one. Months went by. I began working as a part-time teacher in a community center in my area. I taught classes in art, journaling, painting, and collage. At first, I had low expectations, yet people showed up. Strangers with their own stories to tell and silences to shatter, who wished to create something honest. One day, after a lesson, a woman who might have been in her 50s stayed. She said quietly but steadily, I saw you on the news. My kid experienced the same situation. You gave her hope. I was at a loss for words. I simply said, thank you. I meant it too. Peace isn't noisy, I discovered. It is not required to be ostentatious. There is no applause for it. It's being seated next to someone and realizing that you owe them nothing. It's ignoring the family group photo on social media without giving it any thought. It's understanding that my exclusion from the will did not imply my lack of value. It indicated that I no longer wanted to be owned. And what about those who only show you affection when you're helpful? You are never truly loved by them. However, that does not mean you are unlovable. It just indicates that you should quit pleading for a seat at tables where your name is consistently misspelled. My table is little now. However, it belongs to me. As I read, Frankie cuddles up beside me. Along with anecdotes about their grandchildren, my students bring me freshly baked bread. I occasionally receive letters from viewers who claim that my tale helped them feel less alone. I don't reply to every one of them. I do, however, retain all of the letters, particularly those that conclude, thank you for expressing what I was unable to. My mother sent me a card one morning. No address for return. It included a brief statement in neat handwriting that I hadn't seen in more than a year. You weren't worthy of us. I'm hoping you'll pardon us someday. I spent a lot of time sitting with it. I went outdoors to water the lavender after folding it and putting it in a drawer. I've discovered that forgiveness isn't always about them. Sometimes it's simply a matter of no longer bearing their burden. I thus pardoned her. Silently, in private, I let it go after that. I still occasionally see my family at funerals, weddings, and the birthdays of distant cousins. They no longer treat me with the same warmth or animosity, but with consciousness. They are aware of my identity. More significantly, I also do. When everyone else departed, I remained. The person who carried my affection without expecting anything in return. The person who ended the cycle by remaining silent instead of seeking retribution. And if you're viewing this and have ever been the one excluded, undervalued, or removed from the narrative, I would like you to know you're not invisible. You're not too soft, too much, or too hard. Just because someone else didn't see your value doesn't mean you aren't valuable. And sometimes proving them wrong isn't the greatest form of retaliation. Living in harmony without needing their consent is what it is. I made that decision. It's also the most courageous thing I've ever done.